Rich Thanki to my right will do a few, and Chris Szymanski will do some as well, and then we'll go to Q&A. But let me begin by introducing our panelists. So to my right is Richard Thanki, who is an economist who's done quite a bit of work on the economics around spectrum sharing and unlicensed access, and is also doing a lot of work around measurement evaluations around the impact of various different projects. Chris Szymanski, to his right, is Director of Product Marketing and Government Affairs for Broadcom. He's a guy with great experience, DC experience. I actually didn't realize until yesterday how much DC experience you had, which is great. And he's gonna regale us with some of his thoughts today on, especially on the whole LTEU, LAA set of issues. To his right is Shrikant Shenwai, and he's the Chief Executive Officer of the Wireless Broadband Alliance. H earlier talked about some of the correspondence relationships we have with various different other industry groups that are playing various different types of roles in the space, and so we're really excited that he took the time to come here this week, and looking forward to getting his thoughts. To his right is Rich Kennedy, who is a real veteran in this space on spectrum issues and unlicensed access, and has led various different technical groups in IEEE and Wi-Fi Alliance. And so Rich is the Director of Global Regulatory Spectrum at Hewlett-Packard Enterprise, which he was at Aruba before doing work for them, and they were acquired, so now he's working for a bigger company. To his right is Steve Wimsatt, who is Director of Business Development at Ruckus Wireless. You guys probably have heard of Ruckus. They're a significant player in the Wi-Fi space, in particular on enterprise-grade Wi-Fi networks and systems. And then to his right is Robert Wu, who's the CEO of a company called Six Harmonics, which is one of the companies who is today manufacturing TV white space equipment, essentially radios and systems that can leverage the unused frequencies in the TV bands. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to, we could just advance the slide. I'm going to just kind of set the conversation up. So when we formed the Dynamic Spectrum Alliance in the first place, and we're sort of thinking about our policy platform and sort of the breadth of issues that we were going to focus on, really what we wanted to do was begin a dialogue with policymakers and regulators around this whole emerging area of spectrum sharing, and not make it exclusive to one form of spectrum sharing or the other, or to one technology or the other. So what you see reflected on this slide that's being projected right now is sort of my attempt at representing sort of a continuum of different types of spectrum sharing. So anything from exclusive use license frequency, where licenses are assigned to different companies. They have exclusive control over that frequency for a period of time. Think of licensing for cellular operators and other types of traditional license frequencies, where they essentially get a quote-unquote property right for some period of time, and they get the right to exclude others from using that frequency. All the way to the other side of the spectrum, really what we call license exempt or unlicensed, or even licensed by rule access. And Mario from ITU brought up the point earlier. This doesn't mean a free-for-all. The regulator still has an important role to play in establishing the technical rules for access to these frequencies, and how people how different devices operating these bands are meant to coexist with each other. And then through that continuum, you have different types of spectrum sharing approaches. Anything from something like license trading, or secondary markets type of regimes, where it's still within the control of the exclusive use licensed operator. They get to determine the terms by which they share access to their frequency, to things like license shared access we've talked about, where there's a limit to that. So there's a role for the regulator in determining where license sharing, the conditions under which that occurs. So think of the emerging area of user share type of approaches, to things like spectrum overlays and underlays and spectrum commons. I'm not going to go into detail on all of these. I think we're going to have a good opportunity to talk about specific technologies and specific spectrum bands where these different types of sharing regimes are going to exist. So without further ado, I'm just going to hand the microphone over to Rich Thanki, who's going to talk us through some of his thoughts around the economics of spectrum sharing.
Thanks, Paul. Pleasure to be here in Bogota, and I'm just going to quickly go through a few slides talking about some of the economics of spectrum and sharing of spectrum. If we could have...
Here you go.
Okay, if we can go on to the first slide. So...
You can get up and walk around. I know you're,
okay, I'll walk around. So, I mean, I think the first, and then a good place to start is actually why do we have these different regimes for managing spectrum? And the answer is that, we're managing what is a contested resource. There are many people who want access to spectrum, and how do you grant access to the people that want to use the spectrum? Now, one way of doing it is just to have no management at all. But as we've seen with global pollution, if a tragedy of the commons, which can be a very kind of negative equilibrium, can quite easily emerge. And traditionally, there have been really kind of two approaches to saying how do you share a contested resource. And these both come from a very important essay from an economist called Garrett Hardin, called The Tragedy of the Commons. The first is the idea of central control, where a central authority determines that these are the people who will have access to this resource in this way. And traditionally, command and control use of spectrum has been based on that kind of approach. In the 1970s onwards, the idea began to emerge, well, how about we create markets in spectrum? How about we create property rights that users can acquire and then trade to achieve an optimal outcome? And this is very much the kind of the trend in spectrum management in the 1990s and the 2000s. However, spectrum markets have not achieved anywhere near what the proponents of those markets thought they would. However, at the same time, the Wi-Fi approach, the shared spectrum approach, has gained prominence. So it was in the mid-1980s that spectrum sharing of broadband capable spectrum became a possibility. And this spectrum has been incredibly successful. And there's some kind of theoretical background to this in terms of its economics in the work of Elinor Ostrom. But again, this is the idea that you can also manage access to a resource by developing a set of rules that are managed by institutions that enforce those rules, and these rules evolve over time in order to kind of coordinate access to spectrum. So we've gone to the next slide. This is just a quick slide. There's very little shared spectrum currently at the moment. Of the radio frequencies that we use for communication, tiny slivers are license exempt at the moment. Go on again. So, on the left of that slide, there are actually just some general benefits of rule-based access to any resource. So these don't apply just to spectrum, but there are many other resources that we manage in the same way. One really good example is our road network. On our road network, as long as you have a license, your vehicle is road legal, and you meet the laws for doing legal activity, essentially you have access to the resource. So some of the benefits of that kind of system are that, first of all, regulators, governments, and market players don't need to pick winners. They don't need to say, this is the technology, or this is the use that will happen of this resource. And even though regulators say that they want to have technology neutrality, actually the very packaging of spectrum does mean that you are putting some presupposition into what uses will go into that spectrum. Rule-based access facilitates innovation and experimentation with new uses. The barriers to entry are very, very low. And thirdly, and this is really, really important, is that when you have a rule-based access system, it facilitates the creation of services that have public good characteristics, that generate positive externalities, where much of the benefit from that service may be captured by the users of that service or third parties and not be captured by the provider of the service themselves. So someone who puts a Wi-Fi access point into their coffee shop isn't probably getting a lot of that surplus, but a lot of surplus being generated for other users. And if you have a purely willingness to pay-based system, those kinds of uses will fall by the wayside. So licensing exempt spectrum has been incredibly successful. So on the right are some of the successes it's had. By far, the most of the wireless devices sold, the vast majority of them use the license exempt bands by a 3-to-1 ratio over the license bands. Wi-Fi carries 57% of all internet traffic. That's 27 times more than cellular, or 3G or 4G networks, when you include like laptops and all the other devices that use Wi-Fi. It carries more than Ethernet. Innovation. Almost every single new wireless application that is brought to market uses license exempt spectrum, from pollution sensors to pacemakers, which shows that you can get a lot of reliability from open access spectrum. And there's the emerging Internet of Things. So according to some studies, over 95% of devices that will be part of the Internet of Things by 2020 will use the unlicensed bands. So it's been remarkably successful, even this very simple model of sharing that license exemption is. So if we go on. Okay, so this is just a quick but interesting diagram showing how internet traffic is split between various modes of delivery. And this is in petabytes per month. And these numbers are, I think, a couple of years old now, so I need to update them, but they won't have changed dramatically. Wi-Fi carries 2/3 of the traffic globally from smartphones and tablets, and more than half the traffic from PCs and laptops. And interestingly, the kind of spectral efficiency of the 2.4 gigahertz band is at least 30 times greater than any cellular band worldwide, which is pretty impressive. So if we can go on. So I just want to quickly talk about something I think we should think about as we're going through this panel in terms of how we manage spectrum and the technology to make use of it. So I think that there are really 3 great wireless challenges that we face over the next, over the foreseeable future, which is connecting people. 4 billion people are unconnected, connecting the Internet of Things and deriving the kind of value that people are predicting can be gained from this. And as the internet becomes more important, how do we make sure that our internet infrastructure is resilient, adaptable, because it's ever more crucial? So, go on. So, these are the numbers that H quoted this morning. There was a slight error in one of the numbers that H quoted, but essentially, on that chart you have the income of the world's population split into billions, and on the left-hand side you have the kind of affordable broadband spend. So, interestingly, for the people who remain unconnected, we need to provide communication services, and this is assuming 5% of income is affordable, at $12.50 or lower. And for the poorest billion, it's at $2.3 per month or lower. So if you can go on. So one thing I wanted to do was, being here in Latin America, was wanted to show, well, how are the countries in Latin America, how are their populations split between these categories of income? And so here for kind of Central America, we have, the bars in the sections in the pink color are people who are within the richest 3 billion, and the bluer colors are the proportion of the population which are outside. And so you can see there's a huge variation here. Whereas a country like Nicaragua has, the vast majority of its population in the world's poorest 4 billion. In Mexico, the situation is reversed. If we go on, I've got the data for the Caribbean as well. And again, you see this great disparity. I mean, you take the difference between somewhere like the Bahamas and Haiti. The difference is stark. And the next slide is for South America. And again, huge disparities in South America as well. But so even here in Colombia, more than 40% of the population of Colombia is within the world's poorest 4 billion people. And so affordable spend for that population will be $12.50 at the most. And if we go on to the next slide, this shows the very strong correlation between the proportion of a country's population that is in the world's richest 3 billion and the internet penetration. So really, income is the deciding factor of how many people in a country have access to the internet. So if we carry on, couple more slides. Okay, so going to an example that's using TV white space at the moment. So Mwingu, and Malcolm Brew from Mwingu is here with us for this conference, is using licensing and technology, TV white space, to deliver unmetered Wi-Fi access in rural Kenya at $3 per month, which is affordable in that area. It's a very, very poor area, average income $630 per year, but if this model can work in Laikipia, it can work globally. So if we go on, don't need to talk about this, go on again. There is this idea also that license exemption, shared spectrum, means that you have multiple networks in operation. And having that kind of overlap of networks makes for a more resilient architecture. Very often when there have been disasters, unlicensed wireless networks have been the first communication network to come back up, because of course they don't rely on specialist equipment. And the final slide is, I think we are getting to a new spectrum consensus. The orthodoxy of the 90s and the noughties was that the future was all about exclusive spectrum use, using tradable licenses. Shared spectrum was very much a kind of afterthought. It was very much a kind of, something that was a niche that could be catered for very easily. But given where we are now, given the experience of Wi-Fi in the last 15 years, 20 years, given how the US FCC is deciding to approach the 3.5 gigahertz band, the future is a mixture of these licensing regimes, from full protection to partial protection to no protection. And shared spectrum is actually essential, I think, in the new spectrum consensus. And one thing that I'd like to know from this really, really good panel that we have is that intelligence is the key factor that has made spectrum sharing possible. It's been advances in computing that have allowed radios to become intelligent and intelligently share spectrum. Now, technology is not stopping. We have computing power that will increase, we have technologies that are being refined, and more, directivity of radio transmission, greater interference rejection, all of these things are happening, and they're actually making spectrum a less contested resource. And so the direction of travel is very much one where sharing is likely to become the norm under these kinds of technologies rather than be the exception. Of course, there will still always be the need for exclusive use of spectrum, but technology changes and we should think about what that means for the regulation of spectrum.